At 11:47 at night, CEO Vivienne Harrow watched a grainy security feed and saw her janitor pick up a black leather case containing exactly $100,000 in cash. She expected him to panic, to glance around, to slip the case under his cart, and vanish into the stairwell, like anyone else might have done at that hour, in that empty building, with no one watching. Instead, Elias Vance set the case on the conference table, opened it slowly, and began counting every single bill under the fluorescent light. He counted twice. Then he closed the case, locked it, and carried it to the finance department before the sun came up. The next morning, Vivienne summoned him to her office, expecting a simple explanation, a nervous apology, perhaps even a request for a reward. What she heard instead made her blood run cold. "Your money is safe, Miss Harrow," he told her, "but the person who left it there wanted you to find it." Elias was only a janitor. At least, that was what everyone at Northvale Holdings believed. Vivienne was about to discover that the man who mopped her hallways at midnight knew more about her company than half the people on her executive floor. And she had no idea yet how far that knowledge would take her. The rain had not stopped since midnight, and it drummed steadily against the tall windows of Northvale Holdings, 40 floors above a city that never seemed to sleep even when its towers went dark. Elias Vance moved through the executive corridor with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this same walk 1,000 times before, pushing his cart past glass walls that reflected nothing but his own tired eyes and the dim glow of emergency lighting. He had worked the night shift for 3 years, ever since he had taken the position at Northvale, and in that time, he had learned the rhythms of the building better than most of the people who ran it. He knew which floors emptied out first, which offices stayed lit until dawn, and which conference room doors were always, without fail, left slightly ajar after a closed-door meeting. Tonight, it was the one at the end of the hall, the room where the board had gathered earlier that evening for a session so private that even the assistants had been asked to leave. When Elias pushed the door open, he expected the usual mess of coffee cups and crumpled papers. What he found instead was a single black leather case sitting alone on the polished table, forgotten, or perhaps left on purpose. He set his mop against the wall and approached the case the way a man approaches something that might not belong to him at all. When he unlatched it, the sight inside made him go still. Stacks of $100 bills sat in neat rows, banded and untouched. More money than Elias had seen in one place in his entire life. He looked at the cash for a long moment, and then he looked up, instinctively, toward the small black dome in the corner of the ceiling where a camera watched everything that happened in that room. No one was there. No footsteps echoed in the hallway behind him. No voices drifted from the elevator bank. Nothing but the low hum of the building's climate system and the rain still falling outside the glass. For a moment, his mind drifted somewhere far from that room, to a small apartment across town where his daughter was asleep, to the stack of unpaid tuition bills sitting on his kitchen counter, to the years of scraping by on a wage that barely covered rent in a city that never seemed to grow any cheaper. $100,000 would have solved every one of those problems in a single night. It would have erased debts he had carried silently for years, bought a measure of comfort he had not allowed himself to imagine in a long time, and required nothing more than closing this case, walking to the parking garage, and driving away into a night no one would remember. He understood, in that instant, that he could take the case and walk out, and it might be hours, maybe even days, before anyone noticed it was gone. But Elias Vance closed the case, latched it shut, and stood there a while longer, staring at it as though it were something dangerous rather than something valuable, because he had learned, at great cost, exactly what a single wrong choice could take from a man who thought he had nothing left to lose. By 7 the next morning, Vivienne Harrow was already at her desk when her assistant knocked and told her that a significant sum of money had vanished from the boardroom overnight. Vivienne's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened immediately, the way it always did when a problem presented itself to her before her first cup of coffee had even cooled. She ordered the security footage pulled at once, every angle, every timestamp, and she watched in silence as the recording showed a man in a gray janitor's uniform entering the room at 11:41 and leaving 9 minutes later. She recognized him only vaguely, a face she had passed in hallways without ever learning his name, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe the matter was already solved. "So I've found the person who took the money," she thought, reaching for her phone to call security. But when she opened the incident file that had been prepared for her, she found something that stopped her hand mid-motion. Elias Vance had personally delivered the case to the finance department at 5:52 that morning, and every single bill inside it had been accounted for, down to the last $100. Vivian sat back in her chair and read the note twice. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself curious about a man whose name she had never once bothered to learn. That evening, another report landed on her desk, shorter than the first but far more unsettling, stating plainly that the money recovered was not the only sum that had gone missing from Northvale Holdings in recent months. The following morning, Elias was working his way through the 31st floor, wiping down glass partitions in the quiet hour before the offices filled with noise, when a sharp voice called his name from behind him. "Mr. Vance, the CEO would like to see you," her assistant said, and the words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Around him, the few early employees who had already arrived paused what they were doing, exchanging glances that Elias pretended not to notice. A janitor summoned directly to the office of the chief executive was not a normal occurrence at Northvale Holdings, and everyone on that floor understood it. Elias set down his cloth, straightened his uniform without any particular urgency, and walked toward the elevator as though he had been called for nothing more than a routine matter. When he stepped into Vivian's office, he did not lower his eyes the way some employees instinctively did in her presence, and he did not appear afraid, only calm, in a way that made her pause before she even spoke. Vivian placed the black leather case on the desk between them and studied his face carefully before she asked her first question. "Why didn't you take it?" she asked, her voice flat, testing. "Because it wasn't mine," Elias answered simply, without hesitation, as though the answer required no further thought at all. $100,000 could change a person's entire life, she said, watching him closely. "It could," he agreed. "Then why give it back?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. He looked directly at her, and for the first time she saw something behind his calm expression, something old and heavy that he did not explain right away. "I've lost a great many things in my life," he said quietly. "I didn't want to become someone who takes what isn't his." The answer silenced her for a moment longer than she expected, and she found herself studying him the way she studied balance sheets, searching for the number that didn't quite add up. Then the conversation shifted, and she told him, more out of instinct than strategy, that the money bore signs of connection to an internal embezzlement case the company had been quietly investigating for weeks. Elias's response came fast, and it was not what she expected. "I know," he said. Vivian froze, her pen still in her hand, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Elias gestured toward the case on her desk and said the words that would change the direction of everything that followed. "But you're investigating the wrong person." Vivian asked him to explain, and Elias did, carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses steps on uncertain ground. For several weeks, he told her, he had noticed small inconsistencies during his nightly rounds. Details so minor that most people would never think to connect them. Certain conference rooms had been locked at hours that didn't match the building's normal schedule. Files that should have stayed on the executive floor had been quietly moved elsewhere, then moved back before morning. Someone had been using an access badge outside of their assigned hours, more than once, always late at night, and the security camera covering the western corridor had a habit of losing its signal for exactly 3 or 4 minutes at irregular intervals, always just long enough for someone to pass through unseen. He admitted he hadn't understood, at first, that he was looking at evidence of something larger. He simply had a habit, born from years of a different kind of work, of remembering everything he saw. He described it to her the way a man describes a language he had once been fluent in and never fully forgot. A stack of folders, sitting 2 inches off-center on a shelf that had been perfectly aligned the night before, told him someone had gone through them in a hurry. A trash bin in the executive kitchen holding the torn corner of a printed wire transfer confirmation, discarded in a way that suggested carelessness rather than caution, told him someone believed no one would ever look closely enough to notice. A parking level that should have been empty after midnight, but occasionally held one extra car, always the same model, always gone before the morning shift arrived, told him someone was meeting in this building at hours meant to avoid witnesses entirely. None of it, on its own, would have meant anything to most people. To Elias, each detail was a single thread, and he had spent years of his former life learning how threads like these eventually wove themselves into something undeniable. Vivienne studied him for a long moment before asking the question that had been building in her mind since she first read his personnel file. "What did you do before you became a janitor?" she asked. Elias's expression shifted, just barely, and he answered with a deflection so smooth it almost passed unnoticed. "It doesn't matter," he said. But Vivienne did not believe him, and she filed the moment away the way she filed every piece of information that didn't quite fit. At that moment, the door opened, and Callum Rourke stepped inside without knocking, his tailored suit immaculate despite the early hour, his expression carrying the particular irritation of a man who did not appreciate being kept out of a conversation. He made no effort to hide his displeasure that the chief executive was spending her morning with a member of the cleaning staff, and he suggested, in the smooth diplomatic tone he used for every uncomfortable subject, that it might be simplest to let Elias go before the matter became a distraction. Vivienne refused. Instead, she instructed Elias to write down everything he had observed over the past several weeks. Every detail, no matter how small it seemed. Elias nodded once and left the room without another word. When the door closed behind him, Callum turned to Vivienne with a look of quiet disbelief. "You actually believe him?" he said, not quite a question. "No," Vivienne answered honestly, and let the silence stretch a moment before she finished the thought. "I'm trying to understand why he knows so much." Callum said nothing more, but as he turned to leave, he glanced through the glass wall of the office and saw Elias standing near the elevator bank, waiting, patient, unbothered by the stares of the employees around him. For the briefest instant, something changed in Callum's face, a flicker of recognition so quick that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. He knew that face. He had seen it before, in a different context, under very different circumstances, and the realization settled into his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Callum wasted no time launching a quiet investigation of his own, working through contacts in human resources and old industry connections to piece together the history of a man he had once believed was gone for good. What he found confirmed his fear. Elias Vance had spent years in risk management and forensic accounting, working for firms that specialized in uncovering exactly the kind of financial irregularities that now plagued Northvale Holdings. But his professional record ended abruptly several years earlier, cut off with no explanation, no resignation letter, no reference to a subsequent employer. It was as though the man had simply disappeared from his own career and reappeared years later pushing a mop through corporate hallways. Vivienne, working her own angle on the same question, arrived at similar findings. And the gap in his history troubled her more than anything he had said in her office that morning. She found him again that evening, in the stairwell where he sometimes took his break, and this time she asked him directly, "Why would someone who once worked in risk management end up as a janitor?" she asked, watching his face for any sign of deception. Elias did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands before he spoke. And when he finally did, his voice was quieter than before. "Sometimes it's easier to start over than to explain the past," he said. Vivienne pressed further. "Who are you hiding from?" she asked. "No one," he said. "Then what are you hiding from?" she asked again, refusing to let the question go unanswered. He looked out the small window at the end of the stairwell, at the city lights blurred by rain, and answered in a voice that carried more weight than the words themselves suggested. "A version of myself," he said. Through the rest of her own digging, Vivienne uncovered the outline of a story that explained far more than Elias had been willing to share. Years earlier, he had been the whistleblower in a major financial fraud case, the kind of scandal that made headlines for a week and then disappeared from public memory, leaving behind only the wreckage of the lives it touched. In the aftermath, his career had collapsed entirely, his reputation dismantled piece by piece by people with far more power and far better lawyers than he could ever afford. And the person truly responsible for the fraud, the one whose actions had triggered the entire disaster, had never faced any consequences at all. Vivienne sat alone in her office long after the building had emptied, paging through an old archived file connected to that case, and when she found the name of the executive who had signed off on the final report all those years ago, the coffee in her cup went cold before she noticed. The name on that signature line was Callum Rourke. She read the report 3 times, each pass slower than the last, searching for some alternate explanation that might soften what she was seeing. There was none. The document described, in the sterile language every corporate filing seemed to share, how an internal analyst named Elias Vance had flagged irregular transfers moving through a subsidiary account, and how, within a matter of weeks, the analyst himself had become the subject of the investigation, rather than the transfers he had reported. Callum's signature appeared twice, once authorizing the internal review that reassigned blame, and once again on the termination letter that ended Elias's career at the firm entirely. Vivienne closed the folder and sat in the dark for a long while, thinking not about the fraud itself, but about how easily a company could turn the person who told the truth into the villain of its own story, simply because the truth was inconvenient for the people who held the most power in the room. Vivienne moved carefully after that discovery, quietly cross-referencing old records against current company activity, but Callum, as it turned out, had already anticipated that someone might come looking. Before she could act on what she'd found, he moved first, spreading a story among select members of the executive team that Elias was attempting to infiltrate the company's internal systems as an act of revenge for whatever had happened to him years before. The rumor spread quickly, the way rumors do in buildings full of people eager for something to talk about. And within days, several members of the board had grown suspicious, not of Callum, but of Vivienne herself, for allowing a janitor this much access to her attention. Under mounting pressure, Elias was placed on temporary suspension. He did not fight it. He offered no defense, no protest, no explanation. He simply collected his cart, his supplies, and the few personal items he kept in his locker, and prepared to leave without a word of argument. Vivienne caught him near the loading dock before he could go. "You're not going to defend yourself?" she asked, unable to hide the frustration in her voice. "The truth doesn't need me to shout it," Elias answered, "but sometimes the truth loses to a lie told at the right moment." She countered, watching him carefully. "Then don't let them tell it first," he said, and reached into his jacket to produce a small flash drive, which he placed in her hand without ceremony. "I think you'll need this," he told her. She turned the small drive over in her palm, studying it as though it might explain itself without her having to ask. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Since the second week," he admitted. "Then why wait?" she pressed, a note of frustration creeping back into her voice. "Because evidence without context gets buried faster than silence," he said. "I needed you to understand the shape of the problem before I handed you the pieces." Vivienne almost smiled despite everything, recognizing in his answer the same instinct she relied on in her own decisions, the discipline of a person who understood that timing mattered as much as truth itself. She slipped the drive into her coat pocket and told him to go home, to rest, to let her carry the weight of what came next. Though some part of her already suspected, he had no intention of stepping back entirely. That night, alone in her office, Vivienne examined the data stored on the drive and found a detailed log of every instance in which the Western Corridor cameras had lost signal over the past several months. The timestamps matched, almost perfectly, with a series of financial transactions flagged as unusual in the company's own internal audit reports. It was exactly the kind of evidence she needed, precise and damning, but one detail troubled her more than any of it. The data on that drive could only have been extracted from a system with executive-level clearance, the kind of access that belonged to almost no one in the building. And if Elias had managed to obtain it, that meant someone close to Vivienne, someone inside her own circle of trust, had been helping him all along. Vivienne chose not to inform the board of what she had learned, understanding instinctively that the wrong person hearing the news too soon could unravel everything before it had a chance to matter. Instead, she and Elias began quietly constructing a trap of their own, working in the evenings after most of the building had emptied out, speaking in low voices in rooms they knew were free of hidden ears. Together they fabricated a document describing a multi-million-dollar acquisition, a deal so sensitive that only a handful of people were granted access to its details. If the document leaked, if anyone outside that small circle so much as glanced at it, they would know precisely who among them could not be trusted. Elias returned to his usual duties, as though nothing had changed, mopping floors and emptying trash bins with the same quiet discipline he always had, and most of the building assumed he had simply been humbled by his suspension. Callum, in particular, grew visibly more confident, with each passing day, his manner in meetings sharper, his smile a little wider, the smile of a man who believed he had already won. Vivienne played her part as carefully as Elias played his, allowing rumors of her own doubt about him to circulate unchallenged, letting a few trusted colleagues believe she had grown wary of the janitor who once claimed to know too much. It cost her something to do it, more than she expected, because it meant standing in meetings and saying nothing while people spoke about Elias in tones that ranged from dismissive to cruel. She reminded herself, each time, that the silence was temporary and that the version of events currently circulating through Northvale Holdings was nothing more than a stage set waiting for its walls to come down. Late at night, alone with the fabricated acquisition document glowing on her monitor, she found herself checking the access logs obsessively, refreshing the security dashboard every few minutes, as though she might catch the moment itself unfolding in real time. Several nights later, Elias noticed a figure slip into the archive room where sensitive files were kept under lock, and he did not confront them immediately. Instead, he watched. The way he had learned to watch years before in a different life, cataloging every movement without revealing his presence. The figure was not Callum, as he had expected. It was Marlowe Keene, the head of internal security, moving through the archive with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. When Marlowe finally noticed Elias standing in the doorway, the two of them regarded each other in silence for a long moment before either spoke. "You shouldn't be digging into this," Marlowe said quietly. "I'm just mopping the floor," Elias replied. "No," Marlowe said, shaking his head slowly. "You're looking for something." "I already found it," Elias answered. Marlowe's face lost its color in an instant, and Elias delivered the line that would upend everything Marlowe believed he understood about the situation. "The person behind the $100,000 isn't Callum," he said. Elias explained, in careful and deliberate detail, that Callum was only one piece of a much larger structure, a capable enforcer rather than the architect of the scheme. The true mastermind, he told Marlowe, was Soren Bellamy, the chairman of the board, a man whose decades of influence had made him nearly untouchable within Northvale Holdings. Soren had used the company's internal network to funnel money through a series of shell companies, each transaction small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, each one buried under layers of paperwork designed to confuse anyone who came looking. Callum had merely been the one executing the mechanics of the scheme, following instructions, protecting the operation from anyone who might ask the wrong questions. Marlowe, it turned out, had discovered fragments of this truth long before Elias ever set foot in the archive room, but he had been pressured into silence by people whose reach extended far beyond his own modest position. The $100,000, Elias explained, had never been intended as a loss at all. It had been a payment, designed to purchase the loyalty of an employee whose silence mattered a great deal, and that employee had simply forgotten the case behind after the meeting ended. Marlowe sank into the nearest chair, running a hand across his face as though trying to wipe away the weight of years he had carried alone. "I found pieces of this 18 months ago," he admitted quietly. "I brought it to the board. I was told to let it go, told that pursuing it would only damage the company and end my career along with it." Elias listened without judgment, understanding better than most men alive what it cost a person to stay silent. When silence protected, nothing but the people responsible for the harm. "You should have gone outside the company," Elias said, not unkindly. "I know that now," Marlowe answered, his voice low. "But I have a daughter starting college in 2 years, and I told myself the mortgage mattered more than the truth." Elias said nothing to that, because he understood, more than anyone in that room could have known, exactly how easily a person's better instincts could be traded away for the illusion of safety. Vivienne, standing nearby as this conversation unfolded, began to understand that Elias's discovery of the money had never been an accident at all. He had spent weeks noticing the fractures in the building's routine, and by the time he opened that case, he already understood far more about the situation than either she or anyone else in the company had given him credit for. What he had not known, until that very night, was the identity of the person orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Vivienne asked him. "Because I needed to know whether I was dealing with one person or an entire system," Elias answered. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know," he said. Before either of them could say anything further, the door to the archive room opened, and Soren Bellamy stepped inside, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once feared consequences in his life. He looked at Elias with something between recognition and contempt, and he spoke the words that confirmed everything Elias had suspected. "So you've finally come back," he said. What followed was the most personal part of the story. The piece that explained not just what Elias had done, but who he had become in the years since his career first fell apart. Soren revealed that he had known Elias's history all along. That he had, in fact, been one of the very people responsible for burying the fraud case that destroyed Elias's professional life years earlier. Elias had been the one to uncover the wrongdoing at his previous company, but rather than let the truth reach the public in a way that might damage the firm's reputation, the system had quietly reshaped the narrative until Elias himself appeared to be the guilty party. He lost his career in the aftermath. He lost his marriage soon after. Unable to hold together a life that had been dismantled from every direction at once, he became a single father navigating a world that no longer recognized the man he had once been. And he chose, deliberately, to build a quieter existence far away from boardrooms and power, and the kind of ambition that had cost him everything. Soren mocked him for it, his voice dripping with condescension. "You once had everything," he said. "No," Elias answered evenly. "I once believed money was the most important thing there was. And now," Soren asked, almost amused. "Now I know honor is worth more," Elias said. Soren laughed, a short, hollow sound that echoed off the archive room's steel shelving. "Honor doesn't pay for anything," he said. "It doesn't put a roof over a child's head or send anyone to school." Elias's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the anger he refused to let surface fully. "My daughter has never once gone without a roof over her head," he said quietly, "and she never will, because I chose a smaller life on purpose, rather than a larger one built on someone else's suffering." Soren's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, brushing the comment aside with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades deflecting anything that threatened to touch him personally. Vivienne watched the exchange in silence, and something in her chest tightened at the mention of a daughter. A detail Elias had never once shared with her directly, a piece of his life he had kept folded away, private, protected from a world that had already taken enough from him. Vivienne stood a short distance away, listening to every word, and in that moment, she finally understood the true reason Elias had returned the $100,000 that first rainy night. It was not because he was too poor to be tempted, and it was not because he was naive about what that kind of money could do for a man in his position. It was because he had already paid an enormous price for one wrong choice years before, and he had no intention of ever making a choice like that again. Soren, sensing that the ground beneath him had shifted, tried one last time to assert control over the room. "You think you have proof?" he said with a thin smile. Elias set a thick folder down on the table between them without breaking eye contact. "I don't think," he said. "I know." The folder Elias produced that night contained everything necessary to dismantle the operation Soren had spent years building. There were detailed system access logs showing precisely who had entered restricted files and when. There were financial transaction records tracing money through a maze of shell companies back to accounts Soren controlled personally. There was the security camera data Elias had gathered during his months of quiet observation, and digital signatures matching Callum's authorization to transactions he had always claimed no knowledge of. Soren reached for the folder, as though he might snatch it away and undo everything with a single motion. But Marlowe stepped forward and placed a hand firmly on the table between them, a silent signal that the moment for intimidation had already passed. "You had every advantage a person could ask for," Elias said quietly, watching Soren's composure finally begin to slip. "Money, position, decades of trust built on the backs of people who believed in this company. And you spent it all trying to bury one honest employee rather than simply doing the harder thing and staying honest yourself." Soren said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes moving from the folder to Vivienne to Marlowe and finding no ally anywhere in the room. But the largest revelation of the night was something none of them had fully understood until that moment. The $100,000 left behind in the conference room had never truly been the objective of the scheme at all. It had been placed there deliberately, a test disguised as an accident, meant to reveal whether the person who found it would take the money or report it. Whoever chose to keep it would become the perfect scapegoat, someone easily discredited the moment anyone started asking uncomfortable questions about missing funds. a convenient thief to blame for a much larger theft no one was meant to ever uncover. Elias, without ever intending to, had broken the entire trap, simply by doing the one thing none of them expected. He gave it back. Within days, Vivienne called an emergency session of the board, and the meeting that followed unfolded with the kind of tension that comes only once or twice in a company's history. 12 board members sat around the long walnut table, most of them unaware of what was about to unfold, exchanging quiet, uneasy glances as security personnel took positions near each exit at Vivienne's request. Soren attempted to deny everything at first, his composure cracking slightly with every new piece of evidence displayed on the screen behind him, his voice rising in pitch as the transaction records scrolled past, each one another nail driven into a case he no longer had any way to escape. Callum, sensing the walls closing in around him, tried to shift blame onto Marlowe, insisting, in a rush of words, that he had merely followed instructions from people above him and had never understood the full scope of what he was authorizing. But Marlowe finally stood and told the board the truth he had been forced to swallow for years, describing in detail how he had been pressured into silence and how the fraud had operated beneath the surface of the company for far longer than anyone in that room wanted to admit. His voice shook at first, then steadied, gathering the kind of quiet strength that comes only after a long silence finally breaks. Several board members exchanged glances of genuine shock as the timeline unfolded before them, spanning nearly 3 years of shell companies, falsified reports, and carefully hidden transfers designed to look, on paper, like nothing more than routine business expenses. The internal systems were unlocked, and the evidence displayed in full, leaving Soren with no remaining path of denial, his face pale beneath the boardroom lighting as the final slide appeared, a direct trace connecting his personal accounts to funds that had never belonged to him. Within the hour, he had been removed from his position entirely, escorted from the building by security he had once commanded with a single phone call, and Callum was formally suspended, pending a wider investigation into his role in the scheme. When the meeting ended and the room finally emptied, Vivienne turned to Elias, who had remained quietly in the back throughout the entire proceeding. "What do you want?" she asked him. "Nothing," he said simply. "You could have any position in this company," she told him. He shook his head. "I only wanted to be treated fairly," he said. Vivienne studied him for a long moment, and then she said the words that would set the final chapter of the story into motion. "Then tomorrow, I want you back in this office," she told him. 1 week later, Northvale Holdings announced a sweeping internal reorganization that made headlines across the industry. Soren Bellamy resigned from the board entirely, his departure framed publicly as a retirement, though everyone inside the company understood the truth behind it. Callum Rourke remained under formal investigation, his once promising career reduced to a series of closed-door interviews with lawyers and compliance officers. Marlowe Keane was retained, given the chance to rebuild the security division from the ground up, this time with the authority and protection to act without fear of retaliation. Vivienne issued a private, personal apology to Elias, acknowledging that she had nearly let the company discard the one person who had tried to protect it. And yet, despite everything that had changed around him, Elias continued to arrive each night in his gray uniform, pushing the same cart through the same hallways, as though nothing at all had happened. "Are you really planning to keep doing this job?" Vivienne asked him one evening, unable to hide her disbelief. Elias smiled faintly. "Until I find something I actually want to do," he said. She handed him a folder across her desk, and inside, it was a formal offer for a newly created position, Director of Risk Integrity, a role designed specifically around the skills he had spent years trying to leave behind. "I don't need a title," he told her, setting the folder down without opening it fully. "I know," she said. "Then why offer it to me?" he asked. "Because I need someone who can't be bought," she answered simply. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke at all. Elias eventually signed the offer, though not because of the salary attached to it, and not because of the authority the title carried within the company. He signed it because, for the first time in many years, someone had offered him the chance to return to the very thing that had once been taken from him unjustly. This time on terms that belonged entirely to him, he thought, as he pressed the pen to the final line of the contract, about the years he had spent believing that door had closed permanently, about the nights he had come home from a 12-hour shift, too exhausted to do anything but check on his sleeping daughter, and fall into bed himself. about how many times he had told himself that dignity was enough, that a quiet life was enough, that he no longer needed the version of himself the world had once tried to erase. He realized, sitting in that office with the ink still drying beneath his signature, that he had never stopped being that version of himself at all. He had simply been waiting for someone willing to see it. As he walked out of Vivienne's office that final afternoon, a new employee passing through the hallway glanced at the faded gray uniform he still wore beneath his open jacket and asked, with the kind of innocent curiosity only a newcomer could manage, whether he was the building's janitor. Elias looked down at the new badge clipped to his chest, the plastic still stiff and unworn, and then looked back up at the young man with a quiet, unreadable smile. "I used to be," he said. The young employee nodded, unsure what to make of the answer, and continued on his way without a second thought, already forgetting the brief exchange by the time he reached the elevator. Elias lingered a moment longer in the hallway, looking out through the tall windows at the city stretched below, the same skyline he had watched countless times, through the reflection of a mop bucket and the dim glow of emergency lighting. Somewhere far below, traffic moved through streets, slick with the last of an afternoon rain. And somewhere further still, in a small apartment across town, his daughter was probably home from school by now, unaware that her father had just stepped back into a version of his life he once believed was lost to him forever. Behind the glass wall of her office, Vivienne Harrow watched him walk away down the long corridor, past the conference room where it had all begun on a rainy night not so long before, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself something close to peace. She thought about how close she had come to dismissing him entirely, how easily the story could have ended with a suspicious CEO, and a quietly fired janitor, and a truth that never saw daylight. She thought about the case, still sitting in evidence storage, $100,000 that had been meant to corrupt someone, and had instead exposed everything. And she understood, watching Elias disappear around the corner toward the elevator bank, that the most valuable thing Northvale Holdings had gained that year had never been a settlement, or a recovered sum of money, or even the removal of a corrupt chairman from its board. It had been one honest man, willing to give back what wasn't his, even when no one was watching.